Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In the last season, we talked about command, we dabbled in control, and took a largely tactical, maybe land-centric view of C2. We're going to try and expand that prism in this season. The show is once again sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic's world-leading command and control software, the Citaware suite, is in use in 16 NATO countries and more than 50 militaries worldwide. Its open architecture allows complete integration with legacy systems while meeting all NATO interoperability standards, and its intuitive interface bridges language and domain barriers across alliances.
In the first season of the show, we covered a lot of land C2, right? We also dedicated an episode to air C2, so it seems only right to do something on the special attributes and requirements of the other domains, or perhaps environments, as some doctrine calls them. There is something called the power-distance relationship in theory, the presumption by people lower down an organisation that their superiors are right. It's really about the way people in an organisation relate to each other on a hierarchical scale. As one might imagine, the relationship between the highest and lowest people in an organisation is often associated with military organisations that have a very hierarchical structure, more so than many flat-structured new startups or industry models. The highest figures of the power distance relationship are in naval organisations. So you imagine captains of ships in fiction by O'Brien, or that you see a master and commander in the movies. These captains of deployed warships are regarded with almost godlike omnipotence. And that's what the history and the fiction looks like. In most people's eyes, the captain is made out to be a very authoritative, lonely figure. The popular fictional works often depict that caricature really well. And there may be an element of truth to it. Whilst Naval C2 might be viewed externally as dictatorial, perhaps not very cooperative, in my own experience, I've certainly seen some of that in reality. But in most cases, I guess the complete opposite is true. Sure, there are elements about the ultimate power resting with a commanding officer, but that's true across military forces. Much of it in a naval context has to do with the deep historical roots about ships deploying for months or years without much contact to their superiors, or being underwater without connectivity to higher commanders. And that's what makes parts of Naval C2 different. Now, we're going to tackle underwater C2 in a dedicated episode because it is so unique and different. But given the predilection for integrated C2 in discussion these days, I thought it worth exploring what makes Naval C2 different. Indeed, is it different? Are there some unique bits about command and control of naval forces that require a more generic understanding of the domain than perhaps we have in the joint community? I thought a lot about who to pose these questions to and managed to call in a favour and get some time with the Royal Navy's Second Sea Lord, Vice Admiral Martin Connell. Now, Martin's been in post for a couple of years now, and he's the antithesis of that caricature I talked about earlier. It's hard to imagine a less dictatorial individual. Instead, Martin's a thoughtful, empathetic man. An aviator by background, he started his career during the Cold War and has seen the change in naval warfighting as well as in organisational terms. Navies have long been interested in technology. It's the ships that fight, the people that service them and take the decisions, but it's the technology that has been used as a metric to define naval power and prowess for many decades. Martin is someone who understands both sides of that equation. He's commanded a few warships, from patrol boats to aircraft carriers, but his heart, I suspect, has always lain in the people of his Navy and perhaps a love of aviation too. Martin, when we recorded this, had just returned from another bout of travel with allies around the world representing the UK and the Royal Navy. It was a tight fit to get into his schedule, even with a couple of months' notice. So it was a huge pleasure to sit down with him at Admiralty House for our chat. Here's our discussion.
Admiralty House is one of the jewels in the crown in the Royal Navy. It's a real privilege to have this as the Second Sea Lord's residence. And I do occasionally like to work from here, like today. So it's a Friday. The sun's shining, it's quite peaceful outside in the dockyard, not always that way. And I spend quite a bit of my time in the Navy's headquarters on Whale Island in Portsmouth, and there are hundreds of people in there, and I've got a more modern open plan office, more business-like. But here in the study in Admiralty House, it's quite a nice place if you're doing a leaving call with somebody. It's a bit more intimate, and around you are historical artefacts that show the Navy through the ages. And there is an irresistible connection here to the Georgian Navy. We're in a Georgian dockyard here in Portsmouth. And that juxtaposition of Nelson's flagship just a few hundred yards away from where we're sat, HMS Victory, which is still today the First Sea Lord's flagship. And the First Sea Lord or Second Sea Lord have the privilege of going on board there, is just a few yards again from our newest flagship, HMS Prince of Wales. And that, to me, is that story of the Navy. It's the old, historical, proud heritage, which we are really proud of today, but we're also forward-looking as a Navy. And you can do both. I don't think it is, misty-eyed, war in the past. In fact, most of my job is about the future Navy, which is, really exciting. So I quite like it because I look around Admiralty House to see the Georgian Navy, the ships under sail, those fighting ships. But also, and in fact, this table that we are sat around, Peter, this table was Admiral Jackie Fisher's desk in the Admiralty in London. And I like telling that story to people. Now, Admiral Jackie Fisher was renowned for many things. He was a little bit maverick. He had a hell of a character about him. But he was responsible in large part for that shift, that transformational shift from a Navy under sail to one which was the Dreadnought Navy. A big shift at the time. So when people are around here talking about new technologies, disruptive technologies, this isn't the first time admirals have thought about that. And I quite like the fact that we're in historic house and we talk about the future as well.
And interestingly, next door as well, you've probably not seen it because you don't have time, but one of the books in your bookcase is A Sailor's Odyssey by Admiral Cunningham, which to me is the best naval autobiography ever written.
Yeah. The
Caged Tiger doing his thing is just a superb book, really hard to get hold of, delighted to see it in it. Anyway, listen.
You're suggesting I don't read the books?
No, I'm suggesting you don't have time. The span of your coverage is, and what you've got now, and we talked a little about it just before we start recording, right? But it's huge compared to the Second Sea Lord, which used to look after home command, personnel, and that was it. You now own capability, forward look, policy, people. There's a huge amount more to it now.
Yeah, there is, and that's part of the fun of the job, right? And you're right, I've got bookshelves in here, and there are books I'm looking at now that I haven't read yet. So, but I love collecting books, as my wife gets frustrated by. I just collect all of them, and I refer to many books often because there's some pearls of wisdom in there. From events in the past and other admirals and how they've dealt with things, which are fascinating. But the role of Second Sea Lord, it's the second best job title in defence, isn't it? But it doesn't quite tell everybody what the role is. And put simply, I'm one of the Navy's senior leadership team and with specific board-level responsibilities for the future Navy and future capabilities. And we think in decades, because when you're thinking through the opportunities of designing a new nuclear submarine that will be in service well after I have left, and in service, one hopes, for decades beyond that, you've got to have that ability to think through how admirals of the future and sailors of the future are going to operate those systems. So I really enjoy that aspect of the job. The people piece is a real privilege to be the principal people officer in the Navy. And I've been keen to say to many audiences that we are a Navy that innovates and embraces new technology, but we are a people Navy first and foremost. That sometimes gets lost in translation. And that will remain the case way off into the future. And there's a bunch of other things I do as well, which I really enjoy, which I never have time to do full justice to. I think an extra day in the week would be what I'd really ask for. But
you only want to go flying and play football, mate. That's it. That's about it. Right, listen, what you've done there to me encapsulates some things that really we're going to talk about, hopefully, this afternoon, which, there's this history of the Navy which relates to command and control. There's the future which relates to command and control. There's the Second World War command and control, which is really great power competition. There's stuff that's happening today, stuff which is very people-centric, which is the command bit. And there's stuff which is very technical, and the Navy is a technical service. It's a bit like the Air Force. So it sort of mixes all that up in naval command and control. Do you think that at the moment, that naval command and control, as distinct from what happens on land or at the operational level or the strategic level or in the air, do you think there are facets of naval command and control that are very different?
Yeah, there are. And not everything is different. There are some things which are common. We can talk about those. But there's a philosophy of command and control in the Navy and indeed in the maritime, which I think is distinctly different to the other environments. And then there's the science element, which is advancing quite rapidly. So, and let me just touch on the science aspect briefly. For me, you could look at two opportunities in the last 100 years where that significantly changed how command and control was done. Firstly was wireless communications 100 years or so ago, which changed how command and control was managed in the Navy, and it created some fundamental challenges to that philosophy. The other period was midway through the last century when data link started to become a thing. And very quickly, our predecessors looked at that as a real distinct opportunity. So data link, as you'll recall, was the way we get a much enhanced picture and know where all our end forces are, and also aligning radar contacts with a shared picture across a naval task group. We still obviously embrace that today. Yet now, the biggest opportunity, certainly in modern navies, is the speed of data around the system and that ability to harness that to best effect. It's how you sense the data, how you then collate it, and then you use that to your advantage and use various effectors to achieve the outcome you want. That is this generation's challenge. And today's naval commanders are looking at how they can get decision-making tools, AI, to harness that data, because we've got large volumes of data, but it's harnessing it to best effect is what's going to give you that decisive advantage. So the science will change the philosophy. And just on the philosophy, navies operate over vast oceans. That's obvious. But in the days before wireless technology, you took your orders, often from London, and then you were dispatched. And it was months before you would then be able to write back. Now, commanders such as Nelson were prolific writers. They were often sending that dispatch back because they knew what the political intent was and they were keen to sort of demonstrate their part in it. So by its nature, it was strategic, exercising national aims and objectives through the maritime. And you could argue that we've sort of lost a bit of that over time. But the time it took, of course, was a deep frustration to some of those political leaders as well. The Battle of Trafalgar, the well-known Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the dispatches that Collingwood ultimately sent through a schooner called HMS Pickle that then got back weeks later, and then the CO of that schooner got off in the southwest of the UK and a number of horses to get to London to then wake the Secretary of the Navy and explain what had happened. That itself, it just tells you a lot about the distance and the like. But it created this philosophy of once you knew what the intent was, you were then empowered to deliver it. There's still a bit of that, which some will say is romantic, but there's still a bit of that in the philosophy of how we do operations today.
And there's a lot of that still, I'm guessing now, I don't think submarine technology has changed that much, in that some submarines go away for months and they're 8 words a day, 8 words a minute, whatever it is. There isn't the up-to-the-minute data link speed. When ships are alone operating silent and darkened, as it did back in the day, they're operating in a contested electromagnetic environment, just off Ukraine or in Syria or even in the Baltic. You don't have this seamless connectivity anymore. There's a moment at which, for me, it strikes me as returning to that philosophy that you'll remember flying in the Cold War, that you took off from a ship, silent and darkened. You better hope you're pretty good at navigation. Otherwise, there was just a hole in the ocean. You're coming back to out of fuel at the end of the mission. There is some of that which is going back to that philosophy, that deep trust and empowerment, that strategic direction, that freedom that you're delegating down, that's still got to exist. It almost disappeared in the sort of uncontested American hegemony, end of the Cold War, uber connectivity, distributed forces. But it feels like there's more of a requirement of that philosophy coming back. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I think it is. And I wouldn't say that in the intervening years we became lazy. Far from it. And you've just picked on a couple of examples. So let me unpack some of those. You're absolutely right. At the beginning of my career, 35 plus years ago, the first ship I joined, soon after I joined it, and I was one of the Lynx aircrew, it was off on a sneaky mission, intelligence gathering mission. It sailed in the middle of the night, and we sailed darkened, silent, no transmissions on anything. That was the first ship I joined, and it's deeply ingrained in me, that sense of what your signature is you've got to protect. And we were quite successful at it at the time. The proliferation of such systems as GPS have meant that we have to communicate to a certain extent to seek that technological advantage. And now we're in an era where I think we have to, and the operation in Ukraine, we're learning an enormous amount. And we're realizing that the signature is just as important today, if not more important, because you turn anything on in that modern battlefield. And by battlefield, I mean in all domains. There's a signature to it, and you can get thwacked. So we're learning and adapting. Now, there's different ways of disguising your signature, of course. There's different ways of utilizing the electromagnetic spectrum to your advantage. We're relearning some of that at pace. You also mentioned the submarine, and it is just worth, I think, reflecting on the enormous delegation that's given to the commanding officer, particularly of a ballistic missile firing submarine. These are submarines have our nation's nuclear deterrent at very high readiness embarked. And this is strategic. The joint commander for that operation is the First Sea Lord. But ultimately, a commander, usually of commander rank, is given that authority and responsibility. And it's a remarkable mission. And we've been doing it for 55 years now as a Navy. But we have to ensure that that individual has the wherewithal, the broader situation awareness, and understanding of what to do in what could be an exceptionally demanding period, as well as investing in them the responsibility for operating a pretty advanced machine, which is a huge nuclear submarine with nuclear warheads and people embarked in it that operates very stealthily, undetected. That as a mission, I think, is remarkable. And you're right, they're off for months at a time right now. So that in itself, there's not very much control being exercised that often on that particular mission. Set against the ability and means to communicate in a surface navy, in ships. It is very easy for me, if I chose to do so, if I said I wanted to get hold of the commanding officer of a ship that's on the other side of the world, I suspect that poor hapless commanding officer would be woken in the middle of the night. And that's the last thing I want to do. So I'm very deliberate. I say I'm more about the future Navy. My opposite number, the fleet commander, again, would very sparingly intervene on operations unless there was a particular imperative to do so.
But that ability still exists where it didn't before. People talk about the change, the number of signals that Nelson sent at Trafalgar in 1805 and the number of signals that came out of Tommy Frank's headquarters. Just the huge difference. And now the constant stream of J-Chat or Merck or whatever, Centrix, whatever it is this constant flow of information that's going in, but also coming back, right? I mean, it is a constant flow. It is this sort of information overload. There's something lovely to think about the continuum of philosophy of naval command that still sits there, the good parts of it. I'm not talking about the sort of godlike divination of a eunuch captain.
Just because the technological means exists to bombard a ship or a commanding officer with information doesn't mean we should. And we are trying to strip away all of the unnecessary information and administration that we're all familiar with. Because there is something about the essence of being in command, particularly for an operation. Let that individual command on that operation. There is nothing worse, and there are plenty of anecdotes about somebody in the headquarters wanting to know how many, X number of stacked on the shelf, and I needed the answer by tomorrow. That distracts that ship. So let's not do it. We've just got to be really careful about, just because the means exist to communicate doesn't mean we have to. We should be very disciplined about that. And I think back to different spells in my career. I was supporting an admiral just as 9/11 happened. And we moved from the aircraft carrier, which is where the admiral was flying his flag, after we'd done the remarkable initial assault in from the North Arabian Sea through Pakistan into Afghanistan, operating with our American allies. The admiral disembarked into Bahrain. And there were just a few of us moved with him. And we set up fairly rapidly what is now the United Kingdom Maritime Component Commander cell in Bahrain that's still there today. And there weren't many of us, but very quickly we set up all of these various C2 systems. And they're all laptops. And we all know the technology in laptops at the time. They drove me nuts logging on each one every morning. And none of them really spoke to each other. So there were some national UK ones. There were some intelligence ones. There were some coalition ones, but they were fairly embryonic, only with a few partner nations. There was the US ones. And we had this room full of laptops, which gave us parts of the answer, but not all of it. And we recognized then that fusing this all together is really what we needed. So we've managed to fuse together a common coalition picture now in many theatres. But even still, that godlike view you get, whether it's in the CIC of American ship that's got British ships under command or the operations room of one of our aircraft carriers, it gives you that godlike view of the theatre. But sometimes you've got to strip that down, and it's down to the commander to work out, what is that telling me? And this is where the discipline in terms of filtering out unnecessary, it's great to see all the air traffic around, 2,000 miles of the Middle East. But what's it telling you? And strip it all out so that you can then work out it's the one thing that is not in that well-known picture. And this is where AI and other decision-making tools can really help to flag out among the abundance of data that's being presented. This is the irregular aspect. And giving the operational commander that freedom to not care about everything else. I don't want an operational commander to be distracted, sat in their cabin doing business stuff when really they should be dealing with the operational side.
It's the space, right? Which is what historically naval captains have had a lot of. They've had a lot of thinking time. You put a ship on a course and that's you. For days, perhaps weeks, unless the wind changes, that's sort of where you are. I'm interested, you talked there about working in multinational coalitions. Royal Navy's a big part of NATO. NATO is right at the heart of everything that British Defence is doing at the moment. There are very different cultures within NATO, the Germans being a very direct people, the Spanish being more amenable, the Italians doing it a different way. There are all sorts of different characters. In terms of Naval C2, is there a sort of commonality across sailors? Do matlows tend to operate the same way with the captains of ships? And
broadly so, yes. And just your point there about when ships go to sea, it's absolutely the case. And when all lines were let go, you felt it in more ways than one. It was that sense of, good, I'm being set free to focus now on this. I don't have everything else to concern me. And look, we operate in NATO task groups fairly regularly. We exercise it regularly, and we know that when it comes to ultimate war fighting in the future, we will fight alongside our closest allies. And when you know that, it gives a real clear focus to how you would prepare for that and think. Fortunately, I think those who put forward all those common protocols for how we would fight as a NATO, there was huge wisdom in that, because that common architecture, the common doctrine and understanding, the common lexicon has really helped us all. If you take most recently, earlier this year, exercise Steadfast Defender, one of the largest NATO exercises in decades. We sailed HMS Prince of Wales at fairly short notice, and it was meant to be HMS Queen Elizabeth. We found a defect that we felt we ought to set right rather than just hope it didn't break. But you take an aircraft carrier that's in maintenance and then very quickly get it ready for sea. It was heartening to see 24-hour round-the-clock work industry and both ships companies working together. And then it goes out as a flagship. And then very quickly, it is integrating jets, aviation, and that in itself, as you know, is just hard, bringing other force elements together into one cohesive group. But you're also simultaneously docking into NATO architecture. We do now, with our aircraft carriers, operate them under NATO operational control. Not all NATO nations do that with their most prized assets, and I'm really pleased the French are about to do this as well with Charles de Gaulle. So you're operating under a NATO architecture. You've got other NATO ships join into your task group and you've got your own force elements to embark. That's a lot for the commander to work their way through. So if you didn't have those common protocols, you'd be in all sorts of chaos early on. So this is within days you are forming into that. So I think there is a common understanding. There are some common protocols. So if the Spanish ship is detached to go and fuel from the American tanker, the couplings fit. That NATO architecture is not just in communications, is in how we interoperate. And then when that ship comes back into the task group, you know what its endurance is, you know what its capabilities are, and those capabilities ideally are fused together so you can have that common picture of who does what. And we do, in recent years at least, we've delegated down the warfare commander role rather than centralize it in one aircraft carrier, for example. We decentralize some of that out. So in our case, the commanding officer of the Type 45 destroyer will be the air warfare commander. The towed array sonar frigate will perhaps be the underwater warfare commander. And they're working to the embarked flag officer in the aircraft carrier, in our case, the commander of the carrier strike group. Because it is complex. We're fighting in the maritime, but of course there is the underwater domain, which is super challenging and tough to deal with stealthy submarine contacts. You've got a rapidly moving air domain. So fusing that together, I think if you put it all in one room in one person, it can become quite challenging. If you get a commander focused on one particular domain, that tends to work fairly well.
But there's that apportionment as well. I mean, it's very difficult for a non-sailor to imagine a task group going to sea, being self-sufficient, maybe moving themselves halfway around the world as a sort of mass, as a blob. And there are no more resources to call on. That's it. You are self-sufficient for months. And that apportionment, do you send your aviation to go and support one part of the battle, or do you send it 100 miles away to go and do something else? Do you send it on a search for the enemy over there, or do you need it potentially as a weapon carrier to drop torpedoes on a submarine, or does it need to move people around or stores? That apportionment of assets, that control, that's one of the most difficult parts I've ever seen about task group operations. How you apportion that, which often requires the flag officer to step back and say, yeah, okay, you're not around me. I'm good with this. I understand what's going on. Here's my priority. That for me feels very much a much more modern maritime command way of doing things, rather than the sort of godlike individual who runs his ship as he wishes for 3 years around the world.
Yeah. As I reflect back, I was privileged enough to command as a 1-star on a couple of operations and exercises. And that conversation I would most frequently have with, in my case, the Chief of Joint Operations, was about risk and the missions and tasks that I've been directed to do. That was the most frequent conversation we had. And occasionally that would be adjusted based on what I'm being asked to do and the resources I have available to do it. So that's one aspect, that you've got to have that dynamic conversation in terms of the 1 or 2 up and clarifying intent and making clear what you can do with the resources you have and what you might be able to do if you had more. And then maritime manoeuvre, it's often rather flippantly mentioned, but I think it is true, that when we talk about maritime, there's that thing which is we're going to need a bigger map or bigger chart. It is absolutely true in maritime, because you could and often do move a task group hundreds of miles in 24 hours. And that tests your supply chain and your logistics. And we can operate globally, of course. And you've got to be self-sufficient in a number of ways, because you can't with certainty know where your supply chain and how that's going to be impacted. So the importance of afloat support, as it's often referred to, I think we have, on occasion at least, paid lip service to this. We often count frigates, destroyers, aircraft and submarines. And important though those are, what will sustain us is our ability to, whether it's fuel, whether it is war stock, whether if you've got Royal Marines embarked, how you sustain them both afloat and then over the beach should circumstances require it. You've got to take your op stock with you. You've got to be self-sufficient. And then you've got to have the imagination to think, if this gets disrupted, what are my options? And that's the beauty of operating an alliance, because you've got many friends all of a sudden, and that opens up different supply chains and different routes and different opportunities. Quite often, if I didn't have a tanker in command of a frigate, I would go into a NATO jetty to get fuel, and it was super easy, and I'd be out again. You can work with your closest allies to say, hey, look, I'm a bit concerned about this aspect. What can we do to mitigate it? And this is where you can dock into theatre assets. And the Americans clearly are super expert at this. But if we put in, as we often do, capability into other theatres, so take, for example, our planning at the moment is to deploy a carrier strike group into the Indo-Pacific next year. We'll work very closely with the US Navy and US Marine Corps in terms of their different numbered fleets and the theatre assets they have available, so that they can plan the force flow in advance. We can work out how we benefit from that as well. And when talking about theatre assets like air-to-air refuelling, ISTAR, and as well as the logistics, and that's where it really becomes a proper force multiplier.
And I guess that's one of the differences about Naval C2 almost at the planning, well, it is at the planning stage, right? It is, you deploy a brigade from here to Estonia. You've got, logistics problems, you've got connectivity problems, you've got supply chain problems, you've got those. That might be your 6-month mission. Where you deploy a carrier task group to the Pacific, you're passing through 4 different theatres, you're passing completely different sets of allies, you've got different command and control in each one of them, you've got different political demands in each of them. It's not just a case of we're going to need a bigger map. This is exponentially larger in terms of the complexity of what you're dealing with, rather than a single theatre, albeit that might be more kinetic.
Yeah, exactly. And as well as everything you've just described, there is also the fact that a British warship is often used by our diplomats as well in defence engagement terms, as we refer to it. So you need to be a half-decent, at least, diplomat, because you could well be alongside a high commissioner or ambassador and a British sovereign territory in whatever country you're visiting. And that, to me, is, I think, part of the fun of all of this. But we shouldn't do it in a cavalier way, and nor do we. So if you are going through different theatres, you've got to have part of your staff, the commander's staff, thinking about that. So it's how you structure your staff. Take, for example, the carrier strike group. And I've had the privilege of commanding an aircraft carrier myself, but I'm a bit time late now. So let's take our new carriers, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Queen Elizabeth. We have a standing carrier strike group staff. It's about 50 or so in the staff. And depending on what the operation is they get activated for, or if it's a NATO operation or depending where you're going, we'll bolt on additional skill sets onto that staff. So let's take next year. They will have some of the staff who are in that N35 and N5 function. So they are looking at operations that are about to happen and future plans. And you are looking globally, because the carrier could be operating on operations in the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, and the commanders could be absolutely focused on that. But part of their staff are focused on operations down the Red Sea. Well, we know what's happening there at the moment. They're also going to be focused on other emerging scenarios. It could be coup in country X, and there are X number of British entitled people. So there could be a non-combatant evacuation operation that some of the task group might have to be involved in. It doesn't have to be all of it. You could dispatch a ship to go and be prepared too. And then you're thinking about operating in other areas. So it is global. It's different theatres. You've got to have the discipline to think through that way. And again, I quite enjoyed that aspect of the job. And you would give orders out to those ships to say, as simple as, be prepared to conduct non-combatant evacuation operations within the X timeline. And then internally in that ship, it's, right, well, what do we have? What do we need? And they're doing their own estimate of, and then they'll come back with that shopping list of, well, we think this is what we need. So that's going on all the time in a carrier strike group. And you can just imagine, with everything going on in the world today, how that is the case. So, I think the commander has to have that discipline of focusing on the here and now, but looking, what's going to happen days, weeks, and perhaps months ahead.
And that doesn't feel like it's changing. I mean, if anything, it feels like it's getting more busy. The last time the carrier group deployed to the Indo-Pacific, there was a global pandemic, so that was a completely different set of challenges. This time, as everyone's saying, the world is more dangerous. There are more hotspots. US president has described it as closer to the Armageddon clock to midnight. There are all sorts of problems, and therefore it's getting more frantic, more pacey, more busy. I wonder if you think, when we go back to your original point about command being about people, is there a way that you in the Navy prepare people for these set of challenges almost in a different way than we would just give someone who's going to go off and work in the Ministry of Defence or a brigade headquarters or the air component commander, whatever it is? Is there a set of skills that we can give them that allows them this mental capacity to think in breadth, almost more than depth?
So we're definitely adapting how we prepare people for these sort of operations. And technology helps us. We can allow people to dock in and see the architecture in a part of the world before they enter it. They can actually see that picture and know what's going on, the situation awareness. They will tune into exactly what's going on there and see it in advance. That situation awareness is vitally important, I think. There's a mindset as well where we can prepare people for the known missions, and then we can give them sufficient tools to understand when you encounter something else that we've not prepared you for, well, here's how we can help. And here in Portsmouth, we've got the RM Warfighting Centre. It's a new building or a repurposed building. And that ability to reach back, give problem sets back here to experts to work through. You take what's happening just off the coast of Yemen now. We had an understanding of what capability the Houthis had, and of course we've been watching the Iranians for years. But as it's evolving, I think it's unfair to say to the commanding officer of a destroyer on station, hey, work out all that yourself. There's that ability to reach back, both in terms of how they're operating, their modus operandi, our own tactics, techniques, and procedures, and give some of the problem sets back to people back here so they can then provide that reach back support. And I think just on that aspect, there is that sense of, we as a Navy have been renowned for many decades now for having a pretty good sea training setup. Other navies have similar, but the fact that other navies want to send their ships or submarines to us just gives a sense that we've probably got some bits of it right. And I think we have. And what's quite reassuring to me is we're trying to embrace new ways of doing that sea training. We're trying to embrace technology and where we can. But ultimately, it's about preparing sailors for what a busy day in the office might be. And if you look at HMS Diamond or indeed HMS Richmond's experience, many of them have said it is just like training. And that gives us some comfort that, okay, we've all been in those scenarios where, come on, is this scenario really likely to happen? Well, sure enough, the world's a pretty unstable place, as you say, and we've got to prepare our people for making decisions in, frankly, seconds. And that's ultimately, if you've got a ballistic missile or cruise missile coming at you, you better be able to make those decisions in 15 or 20 seconds, which is what the commanding officers of those ships are having to do in some circumstances. And I will, at this point, just credit the 5th Fleet Commander, the American commander, based out of Bahrain, that numbered fleet commander for that region. And I think very cleverly has understood the dynamic aspect there. And in rules of engagement terms, in terms of understanding what's going on, has given very clear direction to those commanding officers, which gives them greater freedoms. That helps enormously. That's not easy to do. In policy terms, we've all been there in terms of there's a grey area when you're embarking on an operation and what are my freedoms, what can I or can't I do? I think it takes a bold operational commander to make that super clear to the subordinate commands. Give them freedoms. That is super important.
I'm smiling because I recently spoke to a Canadian deputy commander of their current ops team, Darcy Molstadt, who said to me, when he was commanding the Middle Eastern coalition CAOC, he said that the really difficult thing was delegation to the point of discomfort is the right place to be. But discomfort is such an unusual feeling when you get to that rank. You're usually pretty comfortable with what you're going to give your subordinates. To give them more feels very uncomfortable. It's not a nice feeling to have. But his view was, this was the place you need to be.
Yeah, and I think I'm referring to Brad Cooper in Bahrain. I think for those of us who have been in the operations room or CIC of a destroyer or frigate, and you've got a fused picture that's presented, a recognised maritime picture, what we really welcome is that ability to delegate down to the commanding officer to act. What we don't enjoy is when you find a scenario, get on the bat phone and let me know. And, that just doesn't work in maritime when you've got things being thrown at you at pace. Now, I think that is one of the advantages we have as NATO Navy. We work super close with our American allies, as you know. We are comfortable being interoperable together. And my ambition and their ambition is to become increasingly interchangeable about how we operate together. We did a bit of that on the carrier deployment in 2021. And you've got to be confident that you're working alongside another Navy or nation, that if you are going to put your forces under their command, vice versa, that they're going to be competent operating in that way as well. So if you've stood in that operations room and you know what that commander is going to need, then delegating may not be as uncomfortable as perhaps it might be otherwise, because you understand that environment really well. And by environment, I mean, yes, being in that operations room, but let's not forget the sea can be pretty unforgiving at times. I've spent months in the North Atlantic at certain times of the year hunting for submarines, and the North Atlantic doesn't care what you're hunting for. It's just relentless, and you can be, with the sailors around you, get quite tired because you've not slept particularly well. And operating in and around the Middle East, operating some of our systems, the sand gets into some sensors, the heat can be quite debilitating. So it is just a challenging environment to be in at times. So making it easier for them is super important.
And all of that part is the interoperability. I've got to say, I found with the Americans, parts of it were easy, parts were really difficult, depending if you were operating with an East Coast or a West Coast fleet, because they almost had different command aspects as well as the personalities. But that's across sailors. And we've said there's a broad homogenization across sailors, sweeping generalization, but we sort of understand command in a similar way, if not the same way. There are cultural differences, right? But now we're talking about increasing integration and fusion, of centralization of command. You might not have a sailor. Brad Cooper might not be your commander. If there was a German general in there, without that understanding, you're going to have a very different set of understanding. You're going to have a different set of explanation. You're going to have a different timeline to bring them up to speed, right? This idea of the sort of the great singularity of jointness, of bringing people together. How do we make up for the fact that there are differences in the land, sea and air environment that are very contextual, right? Those command and control discussions, relationships, conversations are very difficult. The SOPs, how we relate to people. How do we make that work in a sort of joint space at a high level? Is there a way? Do we train people differently? How do we get into that?
So training is a vital part of this. And we'd all acknowledge this is hard. You've got to work at this. The worst thing you can do is just retreat to your own domain and just pretend everything's fine here and everything's rubbish elsewhere. You've got to understand what it's like when you're in every other domain. And when I did the Higher Command and Staff course, that was designed to create a one-star operational commander. And you spent most of that understanding how the other environments and domains think and operate and command and control, and such that if you are a joint commander, you can competently have forces under command. And I think, look at the interchangeable example I gave there. If you take that carrier deployment in 2021, there was a pandemic underway. We had at the time pretty brand new aircraft carrier capability. And there we were saying, hey, we're going to go to the other side of the world. Now, many nations could be forgiven for saying, yeah, we're not in, thanks. Once you got this sorted out, come back to us and then we'll be interested. And with huge respect to some of my American friends, they were brilliant at embarking upon this with us, literally. And we embarked a frontline US Marine Corps F-35B squadron. And that is just not easy. And you can tell by the number of examples of other nations just how difficult it is. But the difficult stuff will win you downstream opportunity. So we embarked with their munitions in our deep magazines. And for anyone who does assurance, that is a proper sport, by the way, getting all that in. I won't bore you with that. The way we operate, while is a huge amount of commonality, our language is different. We call it scran, food on board. The US Marine Corps call it chow. So we have our lexicon, our language is different. The way we do things is different. But I visited the ship a number of times. It was heartening to see how well integrated they all were. And it was also heartening to see lessons being observed and learned and adapted from our own F-35 force to the US Marine Corps. And the force multiplying effect you've got, therefore, is you've got the ability at a time and place of our choosing to do that in the future. That becomes quite profound. And then you can operate from each other's decks. You can operate ashore. You can bring different air defense commanders in who understand how F-35s operate. This is the interchangeability of the future, I think, and it's a profound opportunity. There are future opportunities similarly under AUKUS that we're exploring. That, to me, is really exciting. But it's also, yes, of course, it creates additional challenge in terms of how you force generate, train ashore. It does create some challenges in terms of policy. We've got to get policy folk around the table when you're thinking through operations or the like to work out what are a nation's red cards. What would you be uncomfortable with putting your force elements under another nation's command? There'll be some things that we would be perhaps not necessarily uncomfortable with, but we might want to retain. And as long as you have that open discussion and dialogue, that's fine. Look, we had the Dutch Navy were embedded throughout the deployment as well. And we're going to have different NATO and non-NATO allies and partners with us for next year's carrier deployment. So we're talking to them in advance. We're getting a sense of that journey, because some nations might only be able to operate for a short period of time. Others, it's the whole lot. And you've got to have that conversation with them in terms of, well, look, we're going to force generate and test this quite significantly. Are you up for that? Because if you are, this is what it means. And by and large, many are. But we also recognise that for some nations, perhaps those on the other side of the world, will only be able to join for a certain period of time. That's okay as well. It's not a bad thing to have, friends. Other nations, navies, I think, look enviously at us in that regard.
Martin, brilliant. Listen, I've taken up enough of your time. Great pleasure. Of interest, we are going to do a whole dedicated episode on submarine C2 or underwater C2, because I just think there is a thread there that we need to pull, because it is so distinctly different. It's more like you operating alone and unafraid in a Lynx at night in the middle of the North Atlantic with no diversion airfield and 2 hours of fuel. It's more like that, but doing it for 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is. They deserve a specialist examination. So we're going to tweak that. But thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Citaware is the world's #1 force integration solution, providing full C4 ISR capability across the globe.
We hope you enjoy the show, as well as telling your friends and colleagues about it. Please do subscribe and leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us to reach new audiences and spread the word. The episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for The Way We Work, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.